welcome to another exciting episode of the Candice and Elisa show. So today's topic is one that really does break my heart because I'm such a fan of this individual, but DMX is once again being hospitalized for a drug overdose. We are keeping a critical eye on him to see, if he is going to come out of this. But this also comes on the heels of Demi Lovato's new documentary, where she speaks about when she was hospitalized. She had about 3 heart attacks. I think I can be fact checked on that. And she has gone partially blind in both of her eyes. So she's now unable to drive. But Demi Lovato, the one thing I found very interesting in the documentary, speaks about after being discharged from hospital and after having had such just an excruciatingly painful time for herself and all those who love her, has decided that she will now be what they consider as California sober. So for people who do not know that term, I did not know that term either, but basically how Demi defines it is that she will continue drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana, but she will not do hard substances, which for me is a lot scary, because I feel like if she knew how to control those substances in the first place, she would have never veered into harder substances. So what do you think about this, Elisa? I'd love to hear your point of view.
Yeah, I think the notion that people need to make a turn for moderate drinking and drug consumption that makes it feel normalized and acceptable is quite interesting, because it begs the question, how are we coping these days globally with everything going on? How are we processing what's happening? Because there's a difference between going out and partying or having a romantic evening and having some wine or whatever and overdosing. And it's the question of what leads you from A to B, and why are we placing that need, that necessity to have that term even, For me, obviously, it is a very scary term because this opens the door to a lot of people going, oh no, I'm just California sober. I don't have a problem. I'm California sober. And where the line is of how sober is California sober, just how much alcohol can you consume, how often, and just how much weed can you consume and how often. There's no definition for this. So it opens the door for this blanket statement of, no, I'm fine. I'm just California sober. I don't know how you feel about it.
Well, it scares me, but it scares me more so in terms of how the media's outlook is these days. But I think this is just collectively what I've noticed being a trend in the media, is that because no media outlet wants to be seen as taking a firm stance on anything, they tend to just advocate for everything. And so if you come out and you speak out against a term like California, so and say, this is really dangerous. It's dangerous for the person who's doing it, but that's their choice. But then it's also dangerous for those kids and those people who really do want to get clean and don't have the resources that, unfortunately, like a Demi Lovato has, right? She's got all the resources in the world. She's got access to the best, therapists, psychologists, clinical specialists in the world.
Yeah.
And there are people out there who want to get real sober and they just can't afford it. They can't afford those kind of institutions. And for me, I've seen people speaking out against this California sober statement and news outlets being like, oh, well, we need to respect everyone's rights. And that actually leads me to where I think society is really starting to fail us is, everything has become so acceptable. Everything has become so, we're not allowed to judge anything. We're not allowed to have firm statements on anything. We're not allowed to dislike anything. Coming down to even YouTube wanting and playing around with the concept of removing the dislike button. And I'm like, what if the person is a complete asshole? Like, I need to be able to show you through the algorithm that this is not okay. And so for me, I find it very troubling that we're not allowed to speak out against a term like this because we will get canceled. Because we are not complying with what this one individual feels they need, which is also problematic because if she knew, and this is just unfortunately a cold hard fact, if she had the discipline for, consumption control, she wouldn't have overdosed. She wouldn't have gone. The story she told in her documentary, about how she had been drinking, and that is what led her to calling her drug dealer and in essence, getting her hospitalized. And so for me, I really struggle with it because I'm like, if we become so accepting of everything, like where do we start drawing the hard line, right? Where do we start saying, yeah, like I understand that, but that's not right, and also she's painting herself, at least from my point of view, and I'm open to people disagreeing with me, as a role model, right? Because one minute she's saying, I don't want to be a role model. I don't want anyone to look up to me. I don't want anyone to follow my lead. At the same time, she wants to be an advocate for LGBTQ plus community. And she wants to be, an advocate for drug, the poster child for what drugs can do. And I'm like, you can't have it both ways. Either step away from your position as a role model and say, I'm going to live my life the way I see fit, or speak out for causes, but you cannot do both, because then that just causes confusion. And unfortunately, that starts to persuade people in a direction I don't believe is correct. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting because, as you know, I did a master's in journalism, and obviously the way that you must report is completely unbiased. The moment you take a stance, you've stopped reporting, you've become an activist, right? And so you're not technically ethically allowed to do that. And yet at the same time, sometimes the kinds of things that you're reporting on, I know that journalists have a very firm stance on how they feel, but not being allowed to voice that, I sometimes find that interesting, because, it's almost like telling a journalist, you're not allowed an opinion. And even though I can see the ethics behind that, right? We have to kind of like lawyers, there must be defense and prosecution lawyers. There's got to be somebody that can see both sides and go down the middle. I also feel like journalists have opinions. They're just taught to subdue them. And I often feel that those people on the ground that are seeing things happen, sometimes their opinions are the ones that would matter the most, because they're the ones getting the facts straight from the ground. And by the time it actually comes to my computer, or by the time it actually goes on a news broadcast or even on a print magazine, you don't know how much has been editorialized. You don't know what part of that is advertising. You don't know what part of that is constructed in a way that is, serving someone. So yeah, it's a tough one. And certainly this whole situation with Demi Lovato, I mean, obviously, you know a bit more about this than I do, but I do think that when you have celebrity figures, and this is something that we've talked about numerous times before, the impact and the ripple effect that someone with that clout is going to have is astronomical. And someone with the kinds of music that she does and all that kind of stuff will have a very young following as well. That's so highly influenceable. And I mean, I have to be honest, California sober has a cool ring to it. I want to be California sober, you know what I mean? And if I want to be California sober, I can only imagine there's like a lot of other people going, oh, that sounds really good. I mean, yeah. And where do we go? There has to be a line, not because we're not tolerant, but because we have witnessed people self-destruct, through drugs and alcohol use. And there has to be a line where you go, actually, this is unhealthy. And maybe that's where psychologists need to come in and experts in that field need to come in, but they're not going to be given the same level of a platform as Demi Lovato. So then
it's so scary. I am a little bit, apprehensive about the way society's shifting and moving in terms of, it's almost like people aren't allowed to have an authentic voice anymore. We're not allowed to oppose things that are viscerally wrong to us, or that we feel are wrong to at least our viewpoint, because everything is seen as like hateful. If you're not completely going with one side and one opinion, then you are seen as being like, oh my goodness, how dare you speak out against this thing? Like for me, I'm like, people need to toughen up a little bit. Like, I mean, if people don't like you on YouTube, toughen up. Like, I mean, it's not that big a deal, right? But the fact that now it's almost like society's being coddled and like, handled with kid gloves at every single turn worries me, because I'm like, yeah, but for all those really hypersensitive individuals that you're talking about, because first of all, like we've had, may we say, decades and centuries of people who have survived, and now we're like, oh no, for every human being's mental health, we need to shift and change every single thing in order to be as non-offensive as possible, in order to be as, all-encompassing as possible. And unfortunately, that's not how life works. Yes, I believe in, you need to be respectable in all your opinions. But if your opinion goes against my belief system, I can dislike that. I can be like, I completely respect where you're coming from, but I disagree with it. And so where do we have room for healthy engagement and dialogue? And then when do we become really like, non-tolerant? Because there's someone I brought to your attention, I think it was last week, where I'm not a fan of a lot of what she says, but I'm a fan of her being able to say it. right? And her name is Candice Owens. And so I may not agree with everything she has to say, but I'm happy that she's got a platform in order to say it, because that's how you foster a healthy community. That's how you foster healthy countries and healthy institutions and how we define our morality. But if we're not allowed to say anything, then it almost becomes as though everything is hyper liberal, right? It's hyper, like you've got to be so extreme in your belief system. And if you're not, then it's like you become, the opposite. And for me, I'm just like, this is insane. We are bordering on insanity right now. Like, kids aren't that sensitive. I remember I was a kid. I was not that hypersensitive. I survived it, and I'm not speaking about like, really incredible, and because there have been real stories of real, like, bullying that goes overboard. But I mean, all of us have been teased, right? I mean, we right now in society, I kind of feel like I'm not allowed to really accept a compliment. A man's not really allowed to give me a compliment. This is not really allowed to happen. That's not really allowed to happen. It's like we're living in this weird place that almost like takes the fun out of existing, to be honest.
I feel like we're overcomplicating it, because I think this feeds back into the conversation we had last week about conflict and our aversion to conflict, viewing it as entirely a negative thing. I think there's a huge discrepancy and a huge difference between disagreement, healthy disagreement, constructive disagreement, and attack. And I think that these two things get completely mixed up, especially when we live, and now with the pandemic, we've been living 100% digitally. So when we used to say like there was a world of social media and then we had the world where we actually met our friends, they've blurred. Now everything's been online. That wall of the computer is separating our communication. And I think that immediately, the moment that somebody posts something with an opinion, there's going to be that gung-ho person that's got the sword out and is ready to cut your head off because they completely disagree with you. And it might be a friend, it could be a family member, who the hell knows? It could be anyone, right? It doesn't have to be some Joe that doesn't have a name. It's got like, a weird emoticon beside them. It can be anyone. We're so like short fused. There's such a short fuse, such a quick spark, and everyone's ready to go and attack. And it's almost like we've forgotten that it's cool if somebody has a different opinion, because it creates room for chatting, and somebody might change their mind, or we might just agree to disagree. I don't know if anyone remembers what it was like to agree to disagree, but it's still there and very much accessible. And I think that with all of these topics, it's about that. Obviously, I think that we lived in a world that was very desensitized to people's individualistic beliefs. And, there we have the whole journey with Ellen Page becoming Elliot Page, and that journey, and how important it is to have, specific conversations about these kinds of things so that we become more aware of them. But like you said, there's going to be someone out there that goes, no, that is immoral. That should never have happened. Oh my God, I'm never going to call him Elliot Page because it was Ellen Page. There's going to be that person. And there's going to be someone that wears the flag and takes it. Is it possible for those two people to ever have a conversation? Because in the world we live in today, there isn't that room. There isn't that room. And you know what? There isn't room for changing our minds, which is something we do all the time, naturally, right? So I think we've gotten ourselves into a real bottleneck of problems.
Oh my gosh, but you touched on it perfectly, and I couldn't agree more. I think, I actually enjoy my mind being changed. I enjoy entering a robust discussion with someone where they bring up points and, things I never considered that allow me to look at a problem or situation differently. And I think for as long as we avoid that in society, and you're only considered like liberal if you completely, agree with everything, or you consider completely like conservative. And it's like, I'm neither liberal nor conservative. I'm a human being with opinions. There's shit I'm conservative about, there's shit I'm liberal about. I'm not 100% on any given side, right? And I think for me, even when you discuss the Elliot Page thing, I think it's like, that's an important discussion for society to be having. That's an important conversation to be open. But as soon as I say, I completely stand with Elliot Page and I think what she's doing is incredible and I'm in full support, but I don't completely stand with Charlize Theron, who, her daughter or her son, I don't recall which one she has, decided to identify as the opposite gender, and she immediately started dressing the child in a different, the boy as a girl. And I'm like, you cannot listen to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old telling you I said that as a girl, like, when I was younger, I didn't mean it because I didn't understand the terminology of sex, right? I didn't understand what it meant in society. I didn't even understand my own sexuality. I hadn't hit puberty. So I could not decide if I'm a boy or a girl, right? I just happened to resonate with being a boy because I was a tomboy. But if my mother had started, if I'd said I'm a boy and my mother started treating me like a boy and like started acting like I was a boy, instead of just giving me the flexibility to be a child and not changing my whole scenario and referring to me by, Bob instead of Candice, I mean, it would have blown my mind, because then when you hit puberty, guess what? It becomes a different conversation. Because yes, there's a likelihood the child might stick with being like, hey, I identify as a girl still. Fantastic. But if you choose to enforce identity on your child when they don't even understand it, I think that is toxic. And I also think that is problematic for that child, because if now the child starts identifying and just hearing it being referred to as a young woman or a young girl, I mean, that's going to really mess with that kid by the time they do hit puberty. And maybe they decide, you know what, maybe I am a boy and I want to be a boy, but they've got all this conditioning from their formative years of being treated like a girl. And you know what I'm saying? So I think these are conversations that should be at the table. Like, when do you start listening to your child when they want to transition? What does that look like? How does that, end up unfolding in the future? And I think people like Elliot Page should be leading the discussion. They should be able to say, hey, this is what my experience was as a transgender, female, and now I'm a male. And we should be able to listen. But now, because we don't have any room to disagree with people's decisions, because as soon as I say I'm against what Charlize Theron is doing, guess what? I don't have a conversation piece at all. It's like, well, you're transphobic. No, I love trans people. I love Laverne Cox. I love Elliot Page. I think they're great people. I think they're great actors. I just don't agree with the child choosing their identity, And as soon as they hit puberty and after, their teenage years, I'm open to that conversation with my child. But before then, they have no idea, right? You're not going to be like, your child says, I know how to fly, mommy. You're not going to let them fly off a roof. You're not going to be like, let me put you on the roof and show you you've got wings. No, because that would be irresponsible as an adult, because you're like, oh, my child is thinking like a child should, right? So I think as soon as, like, when society started becoming incredibly oversensitized, I think that's when we are losing. And I agree with you completely. I think the Me Too movement was such a powerful movement. It was so crucial. It was so important, and it was so impactful. However, what I saw it lead us to is like we did a huge pendulum swing to the one side, right? We came from this side of not being seen, heard, acknowledged, and now we're like on the complete extreme end. And now I just hope that, like, I'm praying and hoping with everything in me that the pendulum will get to the middle and we can just be sane human beings again.
I mean, if we look at history, the pendulum never lingers in the middle. It always swings. But no, I mean, I think it's really interesting what you said, because the reality of the matter is that those conversations, even at the moment, I think are seen as a bit challenging. Maybe not taboo is the word, but it's kind of like even just bringing it up becomes a kettle of worms, right? It's like a whole thing, and nobody really wants to touch it. Nobody really wants to have strong opinions about it. And the reality of the matter is, like, on my particular instance, I don't know how I feel, because I feel I don't have enough information. I've never dealt with a child that wants to tell me that there's something that, the opposite sex of what they are born as. And I've never had that experience. The most I've seen is like a Louis Theroux documentary that actually went in and saw children that had started transitioning since before puberty and how that had impacted them. And some were very grateful and some were asking questions, and it was a gray zone. I don't think we have answers. That's the thing. We turn topics where we don't have clear-cut answers to into taboo. And then when anyone comes out with a strong opinion about it, then we got to crucify them on everything that it is that they're doing. And I just feel like we just need to have more of this. We just need to have more open conversations, and we need to stop separating. So, the trans community is having their conversations, the gay community is having their, the straight community. It becomes one of those things where I feel like there's not enough overlap. We don't understand what the other person's going through enough, because we're not allowing for these conversations to take place in platforms that are open and enabling. We make it like, no, you can't have an opinion, you can't do this. And unless you've been on these shoes, you can't have an opinion either. And inevitably, the way my life is going, I don't think I'm ever going to have the experience of being a trans person. However, I feel like I have a huge amount of empathy and understanding and want and desire to learn, that I would love to learn more about it and hear more from people. But those voices are rarely heard. I mean, the fact that Elliot Page was in the cover of Time magazine and they put him there, I was like, this is great. And then you could see on the comments on social media is, I'm sorry, but why is this something that Time magazine should put on the cover of? And people discussing, and I'm going, if we're asking these questions, that's precisely why. And I'm glad that somebody's taking the lead on doing that, but it's just not enough. It's what we said several episodes ago about how, you know, finding models that look exotic or topics that are exotic or taboo or whatever, we see them as one-offs. It's on the cover of one magazine and that's the end of it. We're not going to see a trans person on the cover of a magazine for a long time. And it kind of becomes one of these things where you go, why isn't this normal? Like, why is that definition of someone something that determines whether they'll be on a cover or not? Why is race the question, sex the question, all these things? And it just, yeah, it's a challenge.
I know. Oh man, like every other conversation, this could go on for a while, but we want to hear from you. Is like, are we on the right track here? Because I do feel as though society is, you know, in a troubling space, and I want to be understanding. And I also think it's a hard time to be a celebrity. I think it's a hard time to be a public figure, because every single thing you say and do will be held against you in the court of Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So do let us know, what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with us or disagree? We always love hearing from you, and we will see you next time.